I'm Rosalind Fairchild, 54, and I grew up 4 streets up from a fishing harbor and spent 32 years in a service most people cannot name without being prompted. For 3 decades, I gave that service every holiday, every storm season, and a marriage, and I never once asked anybody to notice. But when a woman in a waiting room at an airbase decided in 4 seconds that my uniform was a costume and put her hand on my arm to walk me toward the door, I made a choice about what I was going to do next that surprised even me. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never bothered to find out who you were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to hold your ground quietly while a room full of people looked the other way, hit that like button and subscribe. The water off the Virginia Capes in October is the color of an old nickel, and at 5:40 in the morning, there's just enough light to see the swell before you feel it. I was standing on the bridge wing of a cutter with a cup of coffee I had already let go, cold, watching the deck crew move around under the working lights, and I was thinking about a woman I had met for 4 minutes in July. That is the whole story, really. 4 minutes in a waiting room at an airbase outside Washington. A woman in pearls looked at me, decided who I was, and acted on it, and I have been turning it over ever since. Not because it wounded me, but because of what it showed me about the room we were both standing in. The odd part is not that she got it wrong. People get it wrong constantly. The odd part is how many people in that room agreed with her without saying a single word. I want to tell it properly, which means going back further than most people would think necessary, because a thing like that does not land on you fresh. It lands on top of 32 years of the same thing wearing a different coat. I grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, in a house 4 streets up from the harbor, in a family that measured a man by whether he came home. My father was Bertram Fairchild, and he fished for a living from the time he was 15 until his knees quit at 60. My mother taught 4th grade at the school on Prospect Street for 29 years. We were not a military family. Nobody in my family had ever worn a uniform except my grandfather, who spent the war fixing engines in Newfoundland and never once talked about it. But in a fishing town, there is one service that is not an abstraction. It is not a thing on the news from somewhere far away. It is a helicopter over your breakwater and weather, and it is a 41-foot boat going out of the harbor mouth when everything else is coming in. In February of 1980, when I was 8 years old, my father took me out of school in the middle of the morning and drove me down to the town pier. There was a scalloper about 11 miles out with a fouled rudder and a bad list. And the word had gone around the way it does in a town like that, which is to say, faster than any official channel. Half the harbor was standing on the pier in the cold. I remember the sound before the shape. Then the helicopter came in low over the breakwater with its lights on in daylight, and it went out over the gray, and about 40 minutes later it came back with 2 men in it who were alive. My father did not say much on the way home. He said one thing, and I have carried it my whole life. Every service says they'll come, he told me. That one comes. I did not decide anything that day. I was 8, but something got filed away where I could find it later, and when I was 17 and a guidance counselor asked me what I wanted, I said the Coast Guard Academy without having to think about it first. I went to New London in the fall of 1990. It is a small academy for a small service. My class was under 300 people. We shared a corner of the military world with academies that had 10 times our budget and 100 times our mythology, and we knew it, and they made sure we knew it. The joke was always the same joke. It came in a dozen phrasings, and it always meant one thing, that we were the coastal one, the lifeguards, the ones with the pretty boats, that our uniform was a costume with a shield on it. You learn early to let that go past you rather than through you. It is a real skill, and nobody teaches it directly. You learn it by watching people who already have it, and by noticing that the ones who argue back never win the argument, they just extend it. I graduated in 1994, 22 years old, an ensign with a commission and a set of orders to a medium endurance cutter out of Key West. I stood deck watches. I learned the difference between what a chart says and what the water does. I got seasick for 11 days and then never again. And in 1996, when I was 24 and a lieutenant junior grade running boarding teams in the Florida Straits, I met the man who set the terms for the rest of my career. Hollis Renfro was a master chief with 30 years in and a face like a piling. He had been boarding vessels since before I was born. He was not warm. He was not one of those mentors who tell you they believe in you. What he did was correct me in detail for about 18 months, and then one day stop correcting me, which was how I found out I had learned it. The Straits in the 90s were busy in a way that is hard to explain now. We were boarding fishing vessels, freighters, go-fasts, sailboats with families aboard, and sailboats with nothing aboard but 300 kilos in the bilge. You went up a side in a swell with a team of 4, and you had about 6 seconds to read a deck. One afternoon, we came aboard a coastal freighter, and the master would not deal with me. He looked at me, and then he looked past me at the 22-year-old man behind my shoulder and started talking to him instead. It happened all the time. I let it run for about a minute, and then I ended it, politely, and we did the inspection, and we went home. That night on the mess deck, I was still turning it over, and I said something about how it would be easier if I could just put my rank on the outside where people could not miss it. Hollis looked at me over a cup of coffee that had been reheated at least twice. "Rank you have to announce isn't rank," he said. "It's advertising." I was 24. I thought it was a nice line. It took me about 20 more years to understand it was an instruction. That is what I gave, if you want the honest accounting. 32 years. Storms in the Bering Sea and storms off Hatteras. 2 Christmases in a row on a bridge in the Aleutians. A marriage that did not survive the schedule, ended without any bitterness in 2007 to a good man who deserved a wife who came home. No children by circumstance more than decision. Rescues that worked and 3 that did not, and I can still tell you the dates of the 3. I gave it to a service that does not appear in the war movies, does not get its own recruiting ad in the middle of a football game, and gets left off the list about half the time when somebody on television counts the armed forces of the United States. I gave it willingly, and I never once asked the country to notice. What I did not know, standing on a wet deck at 24 years old with a master chief telling me not to advertise, was that the bill for not advertising eventually comes due in a carpeted room with leather chairs and a coffee station in front of a young woman who is watching to learn how this is supposed to go. The dismissals never arrived all at once. That is what makes them hard to describe to somebody who has not lived inside one. Nobody ever stood up and announced that my service did not count. It came in 1,000 small subtractions over 3 decades, and every single one of them was too small to mention out loud without sounding thin-skinned. In 2001, I was 29, a lieutenant, and I spent 90 days running port security in Boston and then New York. We were checking hulls, escorting tankers up channels, boarding container ships at the Seabuoy at 3 a.m. with no sleep and equipment we were inventing procedures for as we went. I did not go home for 6 weeks. In the middle of that, I was standing in an operations center watching a television with the sound low, and a panel of very serious people were listing the services that had responded. They named 4. They did not name mine. Nobody in the room reacted because nobody in the room expected anything different. In 2005, I was 33 and a lieutenant commander, and I was in a parking garage in New Orleans that we had turned into a rescue coordination cell because it was the only structure with power and a roof. My job for 11 days was matching air crews to rooftops. Our service put 33,000 people into rescue baskets that month. Some of them were lifted off houses in water up to the eaves by air crews flying in conditions that would have grounded anything else in the country. On about day 9, a reporter with a notebook asked me who was actually flying the orange helicopters that everyone kept seeing on the news. Not as a challenge, as a real question. She genuinely did not know. I have never once heard our name said first. Not in a hurricane, not after a bridge collapse, not in a single article about a rescue in the Bering Sea. I want to be clear that I am not building a case for grievance here. I love the work. If a service exists to be useful rather than to be admired, that is not a defect. It is close to a virtue. But the arithmetic does something to you over time, and the thing it does is teach you to lower your own volume before anybody asks you to. In 2015, I was 43, a captain, and I had a sector in the Pacific Northwest, which meant fisheries enforcement, search and rescue, port safety, and a few Arctic patrol seasons where we cut ice in a place where the nearest help was a very long way away. My crews worked in weather that would close every airfield in the lower 48. Nobody outside the service ever heard about any of it, and that was fine. And it was also a fact. In March of 2019, when I was 47 and 11 months into wearing my first star, Hollis Renfro died. It was not sudden. He had been sick for a year, and he had been extremely clear with everyone about how he wanted it handled, which was quietly. The funeral was in a small church in Rhode Island with about 60 people in it, most of them people he had corrected in detail for 18 months at some point in the last 40 years. I stood at the back in service dress with a single star on each shoulder board, and I understood something for the first time. He had spent his career being the person who said the true sentences to junior people on mess decks. There was no longer anybody standing above me to do that for me. If somebody in my service was ever going to hear that sentence again, I was going to have to be the one saying it. That is a strange promotion to receive at a funeral, and it is the one that changed how I worked. The stars came faster after that than I ever expected. Upper half in 2022, a district command, 1,200 people, and a stretch of coast the size of a small country. Then in 2025, at 53, a third star and a job at headquarters in Washington as Deputy Commandant for Operations, which means, in the plainest terms available, that every operational thing my service does anywhere in the world eventually lands on my desk. Washington is the strangest posting I have ever had, and not for the reasons people assume. It is a town where reading insignia is a professional skill. Everybody in a 5-mile radius of the river can tell a colonel from a lieutenant colonel at 40 feet across the lobby. It is genuinely impressive. And they still could not read mine. My flag aide was a lieutenant commander named Theodora Lund, 33, who went by Teddy and who had come to me off a cutter where she had been the operations officer and very good at it. Teddy was organized in a way that bordered on aggressive. She had opinions about my calendar that she expressed through the placement of the calendar itself. She also spent a startling amount of her working life on the telephone explaining what I was. I came out of my office one afternoon that spring, and she was sitting with her forehead resting on 2 fingers. "Ma'am," she said, "I have now had to spell Vice Admiral to a Colonel's Action Officer twice in 1 week. Same Colonel, different Action Officer." I told her to write it on a card and mail it to them. She said she had considered it and rejected it only because she could not decide on the font. That is the texture of it. It was funny. We made it funny because the other option was to be annoyed every single day for 2 years, which is not a way to live. Teddy and I had a running score of it. Every time somebody in an interagency meeting asked whether the Coast Guard would be sending a representative when I was already sitting at the table, that was a point. In late June of this year, a summit came onto the calendar. State emergency management directors, 3 federal departments, and the whole question of how we pre-position cutters and helicopter crews ahead of a hurricane season that everybody expected to be bad. It mattered. I had been pushing for 2 years to get the pre-positioning decisions made in May instead of in the middle of a storm, and this was the meeting where it was going to happen or not happen. The delegation was flying out of Joint Base Andrews on a Thursday morning in July. The Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, a woman named Prudence Vail, who was 60 years old and one of the most competent people I've ever worked for, was leading it. I was the senior uniformed officer on the trip, which also meant that on the ground I was the principal for the security movement. Teddy and I got to the base early because I always get places early. She had a stack of things to do on the aircraft. I told her to go ahead out to it and take the folder with the state-by-state numbers so she could check them against the final version. She hesitated in the way aides do. "Ma'am, I can wait with you." I told her I would see her at the aircraft. I have thought about that a great deal since. It was not a mistake, and I would do it again. After 32 years, I have learned to enjoy 20 quiet minutes before anything hard. And a flag aide standing at your elbow is many things, but it is never quiet. So I walked into the Distinguished Visitor Lounge at Joint Base Andrews on a Thursday morning in July, by myself, in tropical blue, and I sat down by the window with a folder on my knee and about 25 minutes to spare. The lounge at Andrews is a comfortable room, and it is designed to make you feel like you have arrived somewhere. Leather chairs in clusters, a coffee station along the near wall with the good machine, not the industrial one, a wall of unit plaques going back decades, and a long run of glass looking out at the flight line so you can watch the aircraft you're about to get on, being made ready without having to stand in the heat. It was 0840 hours. There were maybe 14 people in the room. A brigadier general and 2 of his staff at the far end. a civilian couple with government badges, a congressional staffer working a laptop. 3 or 4 people I could not place. Behind the protocol counter was a technical sergeant named Odalis Serrano, 28 years old, who had the specific alertness of somebody who is good at a job most people think is a job about coffee. And at the coffee station, restocking the little baskets of creamer with great care, was an airman first class who could not have been more than 21. Her name tape said Okafor. I found out later it was her 12th day in the assignment. I was in tropical blue. For anyone who does not know the uniform, it is a short sleeve, light blue shirt and dark blue trousers, and for a flag officer, it carries hard shoulder boards with the stars and the service shield on them. It is a summer uniform, and it is entirely correct for travel on a July morning in Washington. It also looks nothing at all like an Air Force or a Navy uniform, which turned out to be the whole problem. Camille Duquette came in at about 0850 with 2 friends. I did not know her name at that point. What I knew within about 90 seconds was that she considered the room hers. It was in the way she came through the door without looking at the counter. It was in the way she put her handbag down on a side table that had somebody else's coffee on it. Sergeant Serrano's posture changed the moment she walked in, and the change was not respect. It was bracing. She was in her 40s, immaculate, in pearls, with the kind of easy authority that comes from 6 years of nobody telling you no. She noticed me about 4 minutes later. I watched her notice. She was mid-sentence with one of her friends, and her eyes went across me and then came back and stopped, and I could see her working the problem. Not a rank, she knew. Not a uniform, she knew. And sitting in a chair by the window in a room she had decided the boundaries of. She came over, her friends stayed where they were and watched, which tells you something. She stood over me, close enough that I had to tip my head back, and she smiled a very pleasant smile. "This room is for real officers and their families, dear," she said. "The general aviation waiting area is back through the double doors. I have replayed this a lot. I want to be accurate about my own conduct because the easy version of this story makes me better than I was. I did not stand up. I said evenly that I was waiting on my aircraft. She laughed. It was a light, social laugh, the kind meant to be heard by the 2 friends across the room, and then she said the sentence that I suspect she has thought about every day since. "That's a Coast Guard costume. My husband is a colonel. Move." There it is. 3 short sentences, about 4 seconds. Now. I had an identification card in my left breast pocket. I could have produced it and ended the entire thing in under 10 seconds. And she would have gone the color of the carpet, and it would have been over, and there would be no story. I want to be honest about why I did not. Part of it was pride, and I am not going to dress that up. But the larger part was older and stranger than pride. After 32 years of being asked, in 100 smaller ways, to prove that my service is a real service, handing that woman a laminated card felt like agreeing that she was entitled to ask. It felt like conceding the actual point in order to win the moment. So I did not move, and I did not explain. I said, "I'm waiting on my aircraft." A second time, in exactly the same tone. Sergeant Serrano started to come out from behind the counter. I saw it happen. And Camille turned her head about 15 degrees and gave her a look that stopped her flat. And the thing that told me everything about that room was that it worked. A technical sergeant in her own duty space, with a job that made her the authority on who was in it, was stopped by a look from a civilian who had no standing there whatsoever. That look had worked before, many times. That was a practice look. Then Camille put her hand on my arm. She took me by the sleeve, above the elbow, closing her fingers on the fabric and a fair amount of what was underneath it. And she began to walk me toward the door. I went 4 steps. I have been in fights on decks in 6-foot seas. I have had a man come at me with a filleting knife in the dark in a fish hold off Marathon. I want to explain that being physically moved across a carpeted room by a woman in pearls, in front of 14 people, is a different category of thing entirely, and it is worse. Nobody said anything. The brigadier general at the far end looked up, took it in, and looked back down at his phone. The staffer kept typing. The civilian couple studied the carpet. Airman Okafor stood at the coffee station with the pot still in her hand and her eyes very wide. And she did not move, and I did not hold that against her for 1 second, then or now. She was 21 and 12 days in. That room had 40 years on her. We were about 2 steps from the door when the light changed. You do not so much see a security movement pull up as feel the room adjust to it. Blue and red came through the glass and washed across the ceiling, doors opening, 2 agents out and stepping wide, and a third one holding at the lead vehicle with the door open. Sergeant Serrano came around the counter fast and reached the door before we did, and she opened it, and she did not look at Camille Duquette at all. She looked past her, straight at me, and she came to attention. "Admiral Fairchild, ma'am," she said, "the movement is holding for you." Camille's hand was still on my sleeve. I did not say anything to her. Not one word. I have been asked about that more than any other part of this, and the answer is not noble. I simply had nothing to say to her that was worth the time it would take to say it. I took my arm back, which took nothing at all because her fingers had already gone loose. Then I walked out through the door that a 28-year-old technical sergeant was holding open, and I got into the vehicle, and the door shut, and we rolled. The last thing I saw through the glass was a woman in pearls, standing in an open doorway with her hand closing on nothing at all, and the door swinging shut behind her on its damper, slow and unhurried, the way those doors do. Teddy took one look at my face when I came up the air stair and knew something had happened. She did not ask in front of anyone. She waited until we were level and the deputy secretary was reading, and then she moved into the seat across from mine and said quietly, "Ma'am." I told her in about 6 sentences, flatly, the way you write an incident report. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "She put her hand on you?" "She did." "Ma'am, I would like to make a phone call." I told her no. Teddy Lund is not a person who accepts a no without an accounting, which is one of the reasons I kept her. She sat back and looked at me for a while. "May I ask why not?" "Because I do not know yet what I actually want," I said. "And I have never once made a good decision in the first hour." That was true, and it was also not the whole truth, and she knew it. Here's what I kept returning to for the next several days, and it was not the word costume. The word was nothing. I have been called worse by drunk fishermen at 2 a.m, and I did not lose an hour of sleep over any of it. It was the hand. There is a specific thing that happens when somebody puts a hand on you to move you. It is not violence. It is not even really aggression. It is a statement about category. You put a hand on a piece of furniture that is in the wrong place. You put a hand on a child who is wandering. You do not put a hand on a person you regard as a person withstanding. She did not hate me. That is what I could not get around. She did not know me well enough to hate me. She simply looked at me and did not see a thing that required consent. The summit itself was 2 days, and it went well, and I want to say what it actually was, because the contrast is the whole point, and I would be leaving something out if I skipped it. 41 people in a room in Charleston, state emergency management directors from 8 coastal states, 2 department deputies, a hurricane season already forecast at above normal, and a set of decisions about where we put cutters, where we stage helicopter crews, and how far in advance we commit them. Committing early is expensive, and it is politically uncomfortable, because if the storm turns, you have spent a great deal of money and moved a great many people for nothing, and somebody writes an article about it. Committing late is cheap and comfortable, and it kills people. I had been arguing for 2 years that we should decide in May. On the second afternoon, we got it, in writing, with the pre-positioning triggers tied to forecast thresholds instead of to somebody's nerve. I mention this not to say, look how important I am. I mention it because the woman in the lounge walked me toward a door to make room for people she considered real. And the thing she was walking me away from was that. I did not sleep well the second night. I sat in a hotel room in Charleston with the curtain open and worked on the honest version of my own conduct. Because there is a version of that morning where I hand her my card at the 2-second mark and she apologizes, and Sergeant Serrano never has to do anything, and Airman Okafor never has to watch. That version cost me nothing but a little bit of pride. I did not take it. That was a choice, and it was partly a good choice, and it was partly vanity dressed up as principle, and any honest accounting has to include both. On the third night, I called Bonnie Sackett, who was in my class at the academy and who retired 4 years ago and lives in Maine with an unreasonable number of dogs. Bonnie has known me since I was 18 and does not find me impressive, which is exactly what you need on the third night. I told her the whole thing. She let me finish. Then she asked me a question that reorganized the entire situation. "Roz," she said, "forget her. Who else was in that room? I started to list them. A general, a staffer, a couple with badges, a technical sergeant, an airman with a coffee pot. And I stopped in the middle of the sentence. Right, Bonnie said. So what did they learn? The general learned that this is survivable and that looking at your phone is a viable option. The staffer learned nothing because the staffer had already learned it. The technical sergeant learned that when she moves to do her actual job in her actual duty space, a civilian can stop her with a look and nobody will back her up. An airman first class Okafor, 12 days into her first real assignment, watched a woman in a costume, as far as she knew, get taken by the arm and walk toward a door while 14 adults looked away. And then watched that same woman turn out to be a 3-star flag officer. I do not know exactly what a 21-year-old takes from that. But I know some of the available lessons, and none of them are good. That it can happen to anyone, at any rank, so there is no safe altitude. That you should keep your head down because everyone else did. Or the worst one, the one I actually feared. That the correct move is to make sure you are never the person in the wrong uniform, which is a lesson about picking a side rather than doing a job. I had spent 3 days thinking about my own arm. I had not spent 5 minutes thinking about the girl with the coffee pot, and she was the only person in that room the whole thing was actually going to shape. I lay awake until about 3 a.m. in Charleston, 54 years old, with 3 stars and a bag on the chair, thinking about a 21-year-old I had not spoken one word to. I flew back to Washington on the Sunday, and on the Monday morning I did the thing I had decided on at 3 a.m. in a hotel room, which was not the thing anybody expected me to do. I did not call Colonel Duquette. I did not know his name yet, and I did not go looking for it. I did not file anything about his wife. There was, as far as I could tell, nothing to file. A civilian with no official standing had been rude to me in a waiting room and had touched my sleeve and had let go when asked by nobody at all. If I had wanted to make that into a formal complaint, I could have, and it would have gone somewhere, and I would have spent 4 months of my life on it. What I did was write 1 page about the room. It was addressed to the wing commander at Andrews, it did not contain a single name, and it did not describe the incident in any detail. It said that on a recent morning, a traveler in the Distinguished Visitor Lounge had been challenged as to their right to be there, and physically directed toward the exit by a person with no official role in the facility, and that the protocol non-commissioned officer on duty had been visibly deterred from intervening. Then it asked 2 questions. Who controls access to that room, and what, specifically, is a family member's role in that control? And it made 1 recommendation, which was that the answers to those 2 questions be written down and posted so that the non-commissioned officer, standing behind that counter at 0840 on a Thursday, knows exactly what her authority is before she has to use it. I read it about 9 times and took out 3 sentences that were about me. Teddy read it and was quiet for a while. "Ma'am, this is going to land a lot harder than a complaint would have." I told her I knew. "You understand it is going to be very obvious who wrote it." I told her I knew that too. I did not want that woman punished. I have thought about that carefully, and I am satisfied that it is true. What I wanted was for the room to be fixed, so that the next person who sat down in it with a folder on their knee did not have to be a 3-star to be allowed to stay. Those are 2 different objectives, and they feel similar from the inside, and if you are not careful, you will tell yourself you are doing the first while you are actually doing the second. The memorandum went out on the Tuesday. On the Thursday, a colonel named Warren Duquette, 50 years old, commander of the operations group at that wing, read a 1-page memorandum about his own distinguished visitor lounge, recognized the morning being described, asked his people what had happened, and was handed the answer inside of 2 hours. Then somebody pulled the security video, and he sat in an office and watched his wife take a Coast Guard 3-star by the sleeve and walk her 4 steps toward a door. He called me on the Friday afternoon. It was not a good phone call for him, and I did not enjoy it as much as you might think. He was decent about it, which made it worse. There was no bluster in him at all. He identified himself, he said that he had seen the video, he apologized twice in the first 30 seconds, and then he ran out of script, the way people do. "Ma'am," he said eventually, "I'd like the chance to make this right." And I had to tell him the truth, which is that he could not because I wanted to punish him, because it was not his to make right. He had not been in the room, he had not put a hand on anybody. The only person on earth who could have made that morning right was his wife, and she was not on the telephone. And in the 6 weeks since, she had not once picked one up. I told him that. I said it as kindly as I know how, which some people would tell you is not very. He was quiet, and then he said, "I understand." And I think he did. The pressure started about 10 days later, and it did not come from him. A two-star I have known for years took me aside after an interagency meeting, very pleasantly, with a hand near my elbow but not on it, and said he had heard about the memorandum. He said Warren Duquette was a good officer. He said the man was up for a wing of his own next cycle. He said, and this is close to verbatim, that these things have a way of following a person around, and that surely the point had been made. I asked him which point he thought I had been making. He did not have an answer ready because he had assumed the point was about the Duquettes, and it was not, and it never had been. I told him that the memorandum did not name anybody, that it asked 2 questions about access control, and that if the answers to those 2 questions were embarrassing to somebody, the fix for that was to write better answers. He did not like it. He was not hostile about it. He is not a bad man, and he genuinely thought he was doing an old friend a favor by warning me about how it would look. That is the part people never tell you about holding a line. It is almost never a villain who asks you to step off it. It is a decent man in a corridor, being reasonable, at a moment when being reasonable would cost you nothing. I held. The first letter arrived at my office at headquarters on a Wednesday in early August, hand-addressed, forwarded twice. It was 2 pages, and it was about her. It explained the position she had been in. It explained what her friends had assumed. It explained the pressure she had been under, socially, in that community, and how the room had come to matter to her, and how difficult the last several weeks had been. Somewhere on the second page there was a sentence that said she was sorry if I had felt disrespected. I read it once, all the way through, standing up next to the window. Then I put it in the drawer of my desk and I did not answer it. The wing answered my 2 questions in the 3rd week of August, and they answered them properly. The new procedure was 1 page posted at the counter and at the door. Access to the lounge is controlled by the protocol staff and by nobody else. Any challenge to a traveler's presence goes through the counter. Family members and guests hold no access control role of any kind, and are not to direct, escort, or approach a traveler regarding their eligibility to be in the space. That last clause is the one that mattered, and I noticed that somebody had thought about it, because it did not say a spouse may not ask somebody to leave. It said a spouse may not approach a traveler about it at all. Whoever wrote that had watched the video. A copy came to me through channels with a short note from the wing commander. 2 sentences, correct and unemotional, the right kind of note. I heard the rest of it in pieces over the following 2 months, and I want to be careful here, because this is the part of a story like this where a narrator usually starts enjoying herself, and I did not. Sergeant Serrano became, in writing, the authority in that room. She had always been the authority in that room in every way that should have counted. Now it was on a piece of paper on the wall behind her, and she could point at it, and she did not have to be brave to do her job, which is the entire point of writing things down. Camille Duquette's world came apart very quietly, and nobody laid a finger on her. Nobody punished her. There was nothing to punish her with. What happened was smaller and more permanent than punishment. She had spent 6 years being the person who ran that lounge socially, and everybody in that community understood that a policy had been rewritten, and everybody understood why, and nobody said so out loud, and it did not matter that nobody said so out loud. The video was never shown around. I know that because I asked later, and because Warren Duquette is the kind of man who would have stopped it and did. But it existed, and people knew it existed, and a description of a thing travels perfectly well without the thing. 2 of her friends stopped calling. The volunteer coordinator role she had held for 4 years went to somebody else at the September turnover through the normal process, with nothing said. The room she had walked into like a drawing room was still there, and she could still go in it, and it was no longer hers. Warren's world narrowed in a way that was real without being dramatic. He was not relieved. Nothing went in his record. What happened was that a wing commander's tone got about 6 degrees cooler, and an assignment conversation in the autumn went differently than it would have gone in the spring, and he will spend the rest of his career not knowing for certain whether that was the reason. I did not enjoy that either. He is by every account a good officer, and he was 300 miles away when it happened. The second letter came in the middle of September. 4 pages this time. It was courteous the whole way through, and there was something underneath the courtesy that was not courteous at all. It talked about how the last 2 months had been for her. It described things people had said. It described a lunch she had not been invited to. And then, near the end, it asked me for something specific. It asked whether I would let it be known that I had forgiven her. I read that sentence 3 times. She did not want forgiveness. If she had wanted forgiveness, she would have had to describe what she did. And in 4 pages across 2 letters, she never once described it. There is no sentence in either letter that says I took hold of your arm and walked you toward a door in front of a room full of people. What she wanted was for the story to stop being told. And the strange thing, the thing that I still find remarkable, is that I had never told it. Not once. Not to a colleague, not at a dinner, not in a corridor. Teddy knew. Bonnie knew. That is the entire list, and neither of them talks. The story that was circulating was not my story. It was a policy on a wall and a description of a video, doing their own work in a community I do not belong to and have no access to. I put the second letter in the drawer with the first one. Meanwhile, the season came, which is what I was actually doing with my life while all of this went on around the edges of it. 2 storms in September, one of which came ashore almost exactly where the model had put it 11 days out. Because of a decision we made in a room in Charleston in July, there were cutters already at sea to the north of it, and helicopter crews already staged inland with fuel and with people. And when the water came up on the second night, we were flying inside of 4 hours instead of inside of 30. I sat in an operations center at 2 a.m. and watched a crew work a rescue in the dark, in the rain, off a roof, 300 miles away, on a screen with a timestamp on it. And somewhere north of there, a woman I had met for 4 minutes was refreshing her inbox, waiting for a reply from me that I was genuinely not composing, because I was busy, and because there was nothing in me that wanted to write it. There was one letter I did answer, and it was not from anybody you would expect. It came in the second week of September in a plain envelope, addressed by hand in careful block capitals to my office. 3 paragraphs, written on the back of a page, torn out of a green government notebook. It was from Airman First Class Sabine Okafor. She wrote that she had been the one at the coffee station. She wrote that she had wanted to say something and had not. She apologized for that, twice, in 3 paragraphs, which is more than the other correspondent managed in 6 pages. And then she asked me a question. She wrote it plainly, without any decoration, the way you ask something you actually want to know. She asked whether it ever stops. I drove out to Andrews on a Saturday morning in the last week of September, in civilian clothes in my own car, and I met her at the coffee shop on the base. I asked her to wear civilian clothes too, and she did. And she looked about 17 in them. She was terrified. She stood up too fast when I came in and knocked her chair. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because a story like this is always tempted to turn a young woman into a lesson, and she is not a lesson. She is a 21-year-old from Baltimore with 2 years of community college behind her and a plan to be a flight engineer. I told her first that she had nothing to apologize for, not out of kindness, because it is true. "Ma'am, I didn't do anything," she said. "I just stood there." "You were 12 days in," I said. "That room had 40 years on you, and every single person in it who did have standing looked at their phone. There was a general in that room. You want to apologize before he does?" She laughed a little, and then she did not. And then she asked the question again in person, which took a great deal more courage than writing it. "But does it stop?" I could have told her it gets better. It is what you are supposed to say, and there is a version of it that is even true, and I decided on the drive out that I was not going to say it. So I told her the truth, which is this: it does not stop. I am 54 years old with 3 stars on my shoulder boards, and it happened to me in July in front of 14 people. Nobody is going to promote you past it. There's no rank at which somebody stops deciding what you are before you open your mouth. But it stops mattering somewhere in the middle of your career without any particular day you can point at. You notice that the thing which used to take a week out of you takes an afternoon and then an hour, and then it is just weather. Not because you got tougher, because you finally have enough real work in your hands that there is no room left to carry it. Those are 2 different mercies, and only one of them is the one people promise you. The one people promise you is not coming. The other one is. Then I told her the practical part, because a 21-year-old cannot live on philosophy. I told her what to say. Because that was the actual injury of that morning for her, and it was not moral, it was procedural. She did not have a sentence. Nobody had ever given her one. Standing at a coffee station with a pot in your hand, watching something go wrong, with no script, is a nightmare that everybody has and almost nobody has been trained out of. The sentence is very short. Let me get the sergeant. That is all. You do not have to be brave, and you do not have to adjudicate anything, and you do not have to know who anybody is. You take 4 steps to the counter and you say the sentence, and then it belongs to somebody whose job it is. She wrote it down on the same green notebook paper, which nearly undid me. Sergeant Serrano got a letter of commendation from her own chain in the autumn for her conduct that morning. I wrote exactly 1 paragraph in support of it when I was asked, and I stayed out of it otherwise because a commendation from a 3-star for a thing done to a 3-star is not a commendation, it is a receipt. At the end of September, I arranged for Airman Okafor to be considered for a joint operations internship at headquarters. I want to be precise because this is the part where these stories usually cheat. I did not give her a job. I made 1 telephone call to a captain who runs that program, told her there was a young airman at Andrews she should look at, and said the 2 sentences I actually believed, which were that she was observant and that she had written to a 3-star to ask a hard question, which is not a common thing at 21. Then I got out of it. The program took her at the start of October on the strength of her own package and her supervisor's endorsement. Warren Duquette wrote to me once more, through his executive officer, in October. There was a wing event. He wondered whether I would attend. I declined, without heat and without explanation. I want to be clear about what that was, because I have been asked. It was not a punishment, and it was not a snub. There is a version of this story where I go to that event, and there is a reconciliation, and his wife and I have a difficult conversation in a corner, and everybody feels better afterward. People love that version. It is on television constantly. I did not want it, not out of hardness. It simply had nothing in it for me. The terms I set were these, and I set them quietly, and I have kept them. Professional, complete, correct. I will work with that officer any day of the week. I will not be produced at a social function as evidence that something has been resolved because it has not been resolved, and pretending otherwise would take a real thing and make it into a photograph. She left the coffee shop that Saturday, walking differently than she walked in. I noticed it in the parking lot, and I have thought about it more than almost anything else in this whole business. I drove home with the radio off. The 3rd letter came in the first week of October, and it was 1 paragraph long. It was better than the other 2. I want to give it that. The handwriting was worse, which usually means somebody wrote it once instead of 4 times, and there was no account of lunches in it and no description of what anybody had said to anybody. It got closer than she had ever come. It said that she had thought about that morning more than she expected to. It said that she had not understood who I was. And then it said, in the last line, I hope you understand the position I was in. I put it on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl, and I left it there for a week. I am not sure I can explain why. I did not reread it. I walked past it 4 times a day on my way to the coffee maker, and I let it sit there like a bill I had not decided whether to pay. The position she was in. I turned that phrase over a lot that week. She had been in a room and she had seen a woman in a chair, and she had decided in under 4 seconds that the woman was in the wrong place. That is not a position. That is a decision that took 4 seconds. But there is another reading, and by about the 5th day I could see it, and I did not like being able to see it. She had built an entire self out of 1 carpeted room. 6 years of being the person who ran it, in a life that was organized around a man's career and a base she did not choose, and a set of moves every 3 years. That is a real position, and a lot of people are in it, and most of them handle it better than she did. I could see it. I still did not answer. Teddy left me in the middle of that month. She had picked up her promotion in the summer, and she had a cutter waiting, which is where she should be and where she wanted to be, and where I sent her with a very good letter. On her last afternoon, she came in to hand over the keys and the calendar and the list of things she had not told me about, and she stood in the door with her cover under her arm for a second longer than she needed to. Permission to ask something not my business, ma'am. Granted. Does it bother you that she never actually said it? That was Teddy, exactly. 9 months of not asking, and then 1 clean question on the way out the door. I told her the truth, which was that I would let her know. I told her I meant it, that it was not a way of ending the conversation, that I honestly did not know yet. She said, yes, ma'am, and she left, and she was on a cutter in the Gulf inside of 3 weeks. The following Sunday, I drove up to Rhode Island. Hollis Renfro is buried in a small churchyard about 1.5 miles from the water. It was warm for October, and there was still color on the trees, and somebody had been by recently and cut the grass. I stood there for about 20 minutes and did the thing you do, which is talk to a stone and know exactly what you are doing. I told him about the lounge. I told him he would have found it funny, which he would have, in the sour way that man found things funny, and I told him he would have said the sentence. Rank you have to announce is not rank. And standing there in the grass at 54 years old, I heard the second half of it for the first time. And I am fairly sure he never said it and never had to. Neither is forgiveness you have to be granted. If I need her to say the words in order to be finished with it, then she still holds it. That is the whole trick of it. Every day I spent waiting for that sentence was a day I let a woman I met for 4 minutes keep something of mine. I did not have any conclusion that afternoon. I want to be accurate about that because this is the part of the story where a narrator usually has a revelation in a churchyard and drives home whole. I drove home, and I still did not know, and the letter was still on the counter. That was also the week that Airman Okafor started at headquarters. I saw her on a Thursday, from a corridor, through the glass wall of a conference room. She was standing at the end of a table in front of about 9 people, most of them senior to her by a decade or two, running a slide about port closure timelines. A staff officer from another service interrupted her to correct something about a cutter's endurance pleasantly and confidently, and he was wrong. I watched a 21-year-old airman say, "Sir, I think that's the older class. Let me pull the numbers," and then pull the numbers, and be right, and not apologize for being right. Nobody in that room knew that 11 weeks earlier she had stood at a coffee station holding a pot, unable to speak. I kept walking and I did not go in, because the last thing that room needed was a 3-star arriving to be moved by something. At the end of that month, a transit came up. The cutter was moving north up the coast for a fleet week commitment, 2 days at sea, and there was a berth and a reason for me to be aboard that was defensible on paper. I have not spent 2 nights on a ship in 3 years. My whole life is a building on the river and a calendar Teddy is no longer here to defend. I took it. I packed a sea bag on a Tuesday night, which I had not done since 2023, and I found my old foul weather jacket at the back of a closet with a name tape on it from a command 2 ranks ago. And I got on a cutter still carrying a question I had not answered, from a lieutenant commander 3 weeks into a cutter in the Gulf, about a woman I would never see again. So that brings us back to where we started, which is a bridge wing off the Virginia Capes at 5:40 in the morning with a cup of coffee I had let go cold. It was the second morning of the transit. The swell was long and easy, and the water was that gray-green it goes in the fall when it is thinking about winter. Below me, the deck crew were moving around under the working lights, doing a job I did when I was 22 and could not do now to save my life. There is a particular quality to being at sea early that I had forgotten. Nothing is asking you for anything yet. The day exists, but it has not started. I stood out there for about 40 minutes. At around 6:15, the officer of the deck stuck his head out and said headquarters had a routine call for me on the secure line. Nothing urgent, just a confirmation on the fleet week schedule. I went in and took it, and the voice on the other end was Airman First Class Sabine Okafor. She was on a joint watch rotation, which is a thing interns do, sitting a desk at 4 in the morning because that is the watch nobody wants. She read the schedule change to me in about 11 seconds, clearly, without one single unnecessary word, and then she asked whether I had any questions. I said, "Negative, thank you." She said, "Yes, ma'am," and she was gone. That was the whole thing. 11 seconds. Nothing happened in it at all. I stood there with the handset for a second afterward, and then I went back out onto the wing, and somewhere in the next 10 minutes, I answered Teddy's question. No, it does not bother me. And what surprised me was the reason, because the reason was not that I had forgiven her. I want to be honest since I have been honest about the rest of it. I do not think about Camille Duquette with any warmth, and I do not expect to. That is not what happened. What happened was that I noticed I had stopped waiting. I could not tell you which day it was. That is the part that got me. Somewhere between a churchyard in Rhode Island and a girl with a green notebook and a season of storms, I quietly stopped composing the sentence I wanted to hear, and I did not notice at the time, and I only found out weeks later standing on a bridge wing with a cold cup of coffee. That is what healing actually looks like, as far as I can tell. It is not a moment. Nobody gets a moment. It is a morning, several weeks later, when you notice you are not carrying the thing anymore, and you cannot say when you put it down. The apology would have been about her. It would have been her account of her own position, one more time in better handwriting. My piece was mine already, and it never required her signature. I spent 3 months waiting for a sentence from a woman I will never see again, and the sentence was never the point. She never had that much of me. I was the one holding it out to her every morning and asking her to sign it. The small things came back after that, and they are the honest measure of it. I slept 8 hours on the second night at sea and woke up not knowing where I was, which is a wonderful feeling if you get it once every 3 years. I laughed until I had to sit down with the cutter's commanding officer over something completely stupid, an argument about whether a particular buoy off Cape Charles has been in the wrong place since 2009, which is the kind of argument that only exists at sea and is the best kind there is. I called my brother back for the first time in a month from the ship at an hour that annoyed him. I ate a meal on a mess deck standing up, out of habit, and a chief told me there were chairs. I got home, and I threw away a letter that had been propped against a fruit bowl for 11 days, and I did not read it again first, and I did not feel anything much when I did it, which is how I knew. Airman Okafor sent a note at the end of the internship. It said the sentence had worked. She had used it once, at a counter, about somebody else entirely, and it had gone fine, and nobody had made a thing of it. Let me get the sergeant, 4 words. That is the whole legacy of that morning, and I will take it. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I have been thinking about who is actually listening to this. Somebody looked at you and decided what you were before you opened your mouth. Maybe last week, maybe for 20 years. And you have been carrying around a sentence you want them to say, rehearsing it, waiting for a room where it finally gets said. I want to tell you something a Master Chief told me on a mess deck when I was 24, and the half of it I had to work out for myself 30 years later. Rank you have to announce is not rank, it is advertising. And forgiveness you have to be granted is not peace. It is a receipt from somebody who was never qualified to issue it. The people who need you to prove who you are have already told you they will not believe you. That is what the demand for proof is. It is not a question, it is an announcement. And the ones who matter, the sergeant at the counter, the kid at the coffee station, the crew on the deck below you at 5 a.m, never asked you for one thing. The sun came up over the water about 7:15 that morning, off the Virginia Capes, and I stood on that bridge wing with the whole ocean in front of me, and I was not proving anything to anybody. I cannot tell you how good that felt. That's the whole of it. A 4-minute conversation in a carpeted room, and 3 months of me waiting for a sentence that was never coming, and a morning on a bridge wing when I noticed I had already put it down. I'd like to hear from you, because I know I'm not the only one who has stood in a room like that. Have you ever chosen not to prove yourself to someone who demanded it, and wondered afterward whether you were right? Was there somebody watching you in that moment, somebody younger who took a lesson from it that you never got to correct? And if an apology you were owed never arrived, how long did it take before you stopped listening for it? Tell me in the comments, I read them. If this one hit home, hit subscribe.